Hello, thank you for waiting. Nice to have you. Okay, so let me get your names down. I appreciate your attendance. Let's see here. So again, as we're going through here, as I'm getting the names down, are there any questions? Ramirez. Thank you, Jaylene, for giving me your last name. Let's see here. All right, we got a full house here. Let's see here. So, Draper. Great to have you. All right, and so we are doing World War II, and oh my goodness, what history nerd and beyond that demographic doesn't like World War II? And so I have a PowerPoint with some of the basics here, and it's kind of slanted toward court history, and that is pro-US, pro-government, right? That we were the good guys in World War II against the Axis powers of Imperial Japan, fascist Italy, and German National Socialist Germany, and fascist Italy. And so at any rate, accordingly there, it says that they, according to the court narrative, is they abused the anti-Versailles sentiment in Italy as well as in Germany to bring forth an administration that was very far to the right on the political spectrum from the time of the French Revolution. Those who wanted kind of regressive, return to the old days, but with a very strong, well, today it's really kind of fascist fashion, more from the from Marxism as an ideological force than from the French Revolution. But that's where we get the terms left and right. But with left and right, what we call the fascist countries, and we're going to get into fascism today. But the first was Italy, right? And notice here that I contend that Italy had switched. Let's see here. Mussolini will use his black shirt thugs to bludgeon, stab Italian communists in urban warfare. He used a strong desire for strong leadership to combat chaos and a sense of national pride. The national pride, it's one thing to have national pride, but this type of national pride was, they use a couple terms in academia. One is jingoism. Jingoism is like fanatical patriotism, and xenophobia, right? And that is being xenophobic is being fearfully hateful and hostile to all those considered outsiders of your identity group. In this case, your countrymen. So for Italy, and the heck with everybody else, everyone else is a potential enemy. And Germany and Japan the same way, with that kind of excessive nationalism. Notice here, he marches on Rome. He accepts the title of El Duce, of the leader, generically. He bans all oppositional parties. And he also takes away the parliamentary's power, checks over the executive. So gives himself almost unlimited power, right? And you see this picture of this guy here, Giacomo Matteotti. This guy wrote ill of him. Really, all he did was just tell the facts of what Mussolini was up to, and bemoan this cult of personality that had evolved around Mussolini. And he was bludgeoned to death. He was killed as a member of the press. So they shut down all freedom of expression, all oppositional political parties, etc. And so, and then they invade Ethiopia. This is the fasci symbol coming from Rome. Ironically, this is found in the U.S. in our our Congress. And it's with the symbol, right, is that one piece of straw is weak and highly breakable. But when they're bundled together, which the fasci just represents and literally means a bundle of straw, a strong bundle tied together, it cannot be easily broken. And so that is symbolic of the fact that they coerced unity. They said it was imperative to have unity, and that unity was to be embodied and discerned and led by one charismatic leader, this cult of personality element to it, right? So it was El Duce, Mussolini in Italy. It was Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. And people equate Tojo as well as Emperor Hirohito in Japan as well, but not as clean of a comparison, to be honest. There were more hands on the wheel, I would argue, at Japan, but it was still very, very similar to this type of government, this fascist type government. Adolf Hitler, right? His Mein Kampf is pretty scary. It's been a long time, since the 90s, since I've read it in English translation, but just very, very ambitious for world conquest, very selective and exclusivist for Teutonic German people only. They use a term, Volksgemeinschaft. Don't ask me to spell that any longer. I have it somewhere in the handout, actually. So at one point I knew how to spell it. But it just means people's community. And if they had decided, according to the Nuremberg laws, that you were not a member of the Volksgemeinschaft, of the people's community, you were to eventually, you had the final solution. You were to be, quote, exterminated. All right. And at first, they did incremental steps. And so they sought out the Jewish population. They sought out the Albanian gypsies. They sought out the homeless, homosexuals, the perennially out of job, jobless, unemployed. They sought out the mentally and physically disabled and tried to sterilize them so that they couldn't have children, because they were highly involved in eugenics and the manipulation of the human DNA code and trying to create this master race of Teutonic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed German people, which ironically the leaders of the German National Socialist so-called republic did not embody. Just one of many ironies, right? Let's see here. They fought on the streets publicly, the Marxists. The Reichstag burnt to the ground, and people have blamed Hitler for the burning of the Reichstag. The Reichstag was the parliament. So there was an attack upon parliament, the building itself. And he used that as a national emergency to give him temporary dictator status. And from there, what's scarier, in my estimation, my subjective take, is that 33% of the population voted for the German National Socialists, because a lot of their platform was anti-Versailles Treaty. And the Versailles Treaty was hated at the end of World War I because of its inequities. It took about 10% of German lands from Germany, of her lands from her. It relegated her to a low military status where they could only keep 100,000 man army and so many battleships and so many planes, etc. They militarized the Rhineland and put international troops on that German soil, and that was seen as a public humiliation. They made them sign the war guilt clause. I want to say it was 251 or something like that, whereby they claimed responsibility for World War I and would have to pay war reparations for it. And the war reparations were high. At one point, the Weimar Republic, which was the Democratic Republic in the 20s in Germany, was seen as being very chaotic and weak. And Hitler used a lot of kind of Friedrich Nietzsche and other ideas in German and social Darwinistic thinking, and saying that they needed stronger leadership and less democratic leadership to get Germany out of the Depression. But at any rate, 33% of the German population voted parliamentary seats for the German National Socialists, the Nazis. And so they got a majority. As a majority party, they could have one of their own elected as the chancellor. And of course, it was Adolf Hitler. And then with the burning of the Reichstag, he never looked back and became the dictator for the rest of pretty much the rest of the war, the rest of his life, supposedly. I say supposedly because there are always conspiracy theories about his death. So let's see here. He bans all of the parties. He publicly arrests and executes leaders of his SA, then forms the SS. They're like his elite bodyguard group. They started putting together the ghettos for the Jewish community and putting them in segregated units. And the euphemism was that they were going to be sent to labor camps. And of course, those camps are known now as death camps, right? As concentration camps. And so I think of Dachau and where Joseph Mengele was, where he did his awful scientific experiments on Jewish children at Auschwitz. But there were numerous of them. And like I said, all you had to meet was that if you did not meet under the criteria for, and oftentimes it was 1/8, which was similar. They kind of borrowed from the American Jim Crow laws as far as determining how Black someone is. If you were 1/8 non-German, particularly 1/8 Jewish, you were undesirable. So let's see here. I hit this point here already. Then you have, they disregarded the Versailles Treaty, and that was popular. That was popularly embraced by the German people as a patriotic, defiant action and symbol. And so they raised an army 20 times the size of the mandated 100,000 man army and began putting the men to work, getting his country out of the Depression and patting himself on the back for it. And but at this time, there were plenty of signals from people that this was a scary regime that was going to have imperialistic ambitions over other countries. Then you have, so then he recognizes a so-called referendum by Austria. And I still don't know the truth behind this, to what extent there was acquiescence or approval by the Austrian people. But he contends that in the referendum that the Austrian people had chosen themselves, that they wanted to be annexed by Germany. And we had forbidden that in the Versailles Treaty for Austria and Germany to be, we mandated that they be separated, the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, particularly Prussia. And so then he takes the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland was part of a modern country known as Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic. It did have a lot of German people in it. So the argument goes, the narrative goes, is there was some semblance of rationality in his demands at first. They seemed to some people as remotely reasonable in saying, hey, they're mostly Germans in the Sudetenland, so we're taking it back, right? And so Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain, the prime minister, he goes down in history as the great appeaser to the bully, and says, because he used that term, that Germany ought to be appeased, that she's angry, we ought to give her what she wants, and she'll be satisfied, hopefully, which of course she was not, right, in hindsight. They took the port of Danzig from the new country of Poland, because remember, that was one thing that did stick from Woodrow Wilson, is his idea of self-determination for some peoples, some countries at least. So some modern countries came out of these international empires that were broken up at the end of World War I. So in the Near East, you had modern Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, etc. in the Near East, coming from the Ottoman Empire being broken up. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had Czechoslovakia, Poland, Serbia, etc. So at any rate, he takes, after he takes the Sudetenland, he takes all of Czechoslovakia, right? Let's see here. And then before you know it, he goes after Poland, Belgium, Switzerland, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, France, etc. And thus ensues World War II. All right. And so obviously appeasement did not work when it came to Adolf Hitler and the German National Socialists. 36 was a big year for the Japanese. Their assassination ring, they went after the prime minister, the premier himself, the imperialists amongst the Japanese. A lot of the young officers attempted a coup over the older officers who were more conservative over foreign policy because they wanted a more robust, aggressive foreign policy. They wanted Manchukuo, they wanted Manchuria, they wanted eventually China, and then eventually it's going to morph into by 1941 into their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as it's translated into English. Asia for the Asians on paper, but really Asia for Japan. Okay, and so let's see here. The Mukden incident, they believe that the Japanese did that themselves. They blew up a railroad and they blamed the Chinese for it. And so in the 30s, they were fighting the Chinese, and you had the rape of Nanking. And the rape of Nanking was horrific as far as the murder of just so many civilians. I can't even say, I knew at one point, I want to say thousands, but I mean, honestly, I think it was at least the tens of thousands, if not more. It was awful. Like, so there you see a bunch of skulls here on the PowerPoint, covered, which probably rightfully so, by our names, is a man being used as human bayonet practice. Just horrific crimes against humanity inaugurated by Imperial Japan in the 1930s and 1940s during World War II and before it. And so they had plans for Burma, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, right? And they're going to make their way all the way down to Guinea, to New Guinea, down just above Australia, and trying to take all of the Pacific. It was pretty scary how much and how quickly they took up to 1942. It plays kind of like a Rocky movie. The Germans and the Japanese in particular were very successful, very efficient, very quick, and taking over other countries up to about from 39 to 42. And 42 was pretty much a turning point year. All right. And so at any rate, then it goes on to Pearl Harbor and the fighting and so forth. But at this point, I want to go back to the assignment. All right. So you'll bear with me here. Let's see. So the idea of a just war is a Roman Catholic idea, right? And it's dealing with the conundrum, the ethical conundrum of taking a life when Jesus said, right, turn the other cheek if someone strikes you, and let him strike the other one as well. And don't return an eye for an eye, and to show grace to your enemies and mercy. But it's a little bit more complex than that, according to the Catholic theologians like Augustine of Hippo. When you look at Romans and Thessalonians, for instance, they contend that the powers that be, and it recognizes that those powers oftentimes will not be Christians themselves, but it refers and it's interpreted to the military establishment and to the police forces in both these books of the Bible, are intended to carry out the justice, the righteousness, and even the wrath of God. And so some people take those verses to contend that, okay, then violence can be condoned within the proper context, within the proper situation, right? That if a police officer goes and there's domestic dispute and someone is killing the process of trying to murder his wife, that the police can in turn murder him. And it would not be considered murder according to the Christian clergy, okay, and to God. And so at any rate, if you want to look at the idea of just war doctrine, supposedly it's encapsulated pretty well during the early modern era. I want to say like around like the time of humanism and so forth. I want to say like 1600s. Hugo Grotius, if you want to look further into this. But look what he contends, at least from what I've read of him. As for Grotius's arguments, he contended that for a war to be considered ethically just or warranted, both the reasons for fighting and the manner by which it is fought ought to meet certain standards. So there's casus belli, the Latin term, right? The reason for fighting has to be considered righteous, and the jus ad bellum. I don't know exactly what that means in Latin, but it means the manner by which you're fighting the war. So the reasons for which and the manner by which you fight have to be considered just for a war to be considered justifiable from a Judeo-Christian worldview, all right, according to this doctrine. So let's see here. Conversely, a just war may be, so as for motives, personal, selfish, material gain cannot serve as motivating factors, nor vanity, nor revenge. Conversely, a just war may be fought in a chivalric manner, the idea of noblesse oblige, the nobleman's obligation, to protect a weaker party unable to defend itself from the unwarranted aggression of a stronger party or bully. Moreover, a just war may be fought to defend one's own people from unwarranted aggression, or to prevent or rectify a clear injustice involving unwarranted, unprovoked, right, unnecessary despoliation, taking property and possessions from people, inequity, unfairly depriving a party of his or her due, or harm. All right. So as for the manner by which a war is to be fought, Hugo Grotius demanded, but did not limit to the following. It ought to be officially declared without deceptive or preemptive attack. So the good guy doesn't punch first, so to speak. It ought to be gentlemanly, fought between official, professional armed forces and non-combatants. Civilian locations and other venues outside the battlefield ought to be considered out of bounds, as would in modern parlance spectators at a football game, the way they ought to feel free from the danger of a football player running up into the stands and tackling them, right? Furthermore, any further legal or societal norms of proper behavior befitting a soldier in one's contemporary world ought to be recognized and followed. So hence they acknowledged that future generations will put up certain international notions of right and wrong as far as combat deployment and what ought to be considered illegal, and they ought to abide by those contemporary rules. So I think of like mustard gas in World War I, right? That attacks responsive to those of another ought to be proportional. Proportionality was a big part of his doctrine, suggesting that an attack upon one's village resulting in, let's say, 20 casualties ought not to be reciprocated by leveling several cities and hence taking tens of thousands of lives in return. That would not be considered proportional, right? Finally, that victory ought to be attainable by way of fighting by conventional means only, and that if methods universally considered to be inhumane or unfair for lack of the other party's limitations are necessary to win, the party in possession of such an unethical, unfair weapon ought not use it. So people have wondered that about our atomic bomb that we dropped 2 of on Japan at the end of this war. Take the moral high ground and trust that Providence will defend her noble decision. Within such boundaries, the Catholic Church and Hugo Grotius contend a Christian may fight, kill, and die in battle without fear of hypocrisy and condemnation from man and God. All right. And so during World War II, before we even entered formally, President Franklin Roosevelt met with the British Bulldog, Winston Churchill, and they devised the Atlantic Charter. And they came up with a notion, to me, it's tied to classical liberalism, like John Stuart Mill in his writings in the 1800s, that the individual is and ought to be autonomous, ought to be the arbiter, the decider of his or her own destiny, ought to be free to do what he or she wants on a daily basis. I heard someone put the limitations to this freedom in the following kind of dictum, is he said, your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. So you could do whatever you want until it harms, until your practice of liberty steps upon, infringes upon the liberty of someone else. But up to that point, right, you're free to be yourself and do your own thing. So a lot is encapsulated in that, right? Freedom of discourse and debate and disagreement and protest, peacefully protesting the government, and engaging in civil disobedience, etc. Right? And I say here on number one is clearly fascism had no room for classical liberalism, because with fascism, right, their idea is they made the organic symbol of like the human body, and said, okay, we as the SS and the leaders of German National Socialist Party are the proverbial brain and head, and we dictate, especially our Führer, right, our leader Adolf Hitler, dictates policy, and there is no room for disagreement, no oppositional parties, no protest in the press. None of that is to be tolerated under a fascist government. And that you might be the proverbial legs as far as doing the industrial labor in the factories to produce the commodities and the war machine that they need during World War II. You might be the proverbial eyes as far as being the intelligentsia maybe, but everything you do, the whole body cannot fight against itself. The whole body has to function in unison, in coordination, and there's no room for discontinuity. There's no room for one member of the body fighting against or opposing the other members of the body. So they forced conformity. You had to conform to the German National Socialist agenda, or you're in trouble. Eventually, right, usually the Gestapo, the military police, would come to your door and people would not see you again, at least until the end of the war, perhaps if you survived in a concentration camp, etc. Or if not, you would be oftentimes tried and executed, or even not even tried and just outright executed. So what I'm saying here, right, is that fascism is inherently inimical. It's dangerous. It's inherently antithetical against the opposite of what we hold to be sacred in modern America, individual rights, namely individual rights under classical liberalism and under the notions of natural rights in the Enlightenment of the 1700s. And so it was as if they had gone back prior to the Enlightenment, prior to classical liberalism, and we're back to this, dictatorial type of government, military-led, just archaic type of government, despite all the accoutrements of modernity that they combined this old school government with, right? So at any rate, that's my main point there. There's the term Volksgemeinschaft. The Einsatzgruppen, that was scary. That was known as the cleanup crew. And they were responsible for determining when they took over another country, who was considered, who would be treated as a member of the German community, and who would be excluded from that. And of course, remember, like I said, with exclusion, it was a secret meeting, and there is, they literally have it written on a document, but they use the term final solution, right? That they're going to use in the Nuremberg trials to try the German leaders at the end of World War II for war crimes against humanity. And so the Einsatzgruppen would come in, and they, for instance, in Russia, they decided that the Russian people as a Slovak ethnic group were inferior, were undesirables. And so they began mowing down civilians and killing millions of them behind the battle lines. The Einsatzgruppen, if you were to look up into that further, Very intriguing, but very dark. All right. So you see here, I have at the bottom, clearly the world was much better off and freer because we won and defeated fascism, a political ideology and system that is inherently poisonous to all things held sacred in modern Western civilization. So does anybody have any questions about number one? So that's Mussolini and Hitler. That's the Einsatzgruppen executing people behind enemy lines. That's a Nuremberg rally in the top right. And that is Joseph Mengele of Auschwitz, who did the horrific experiments on Jewish and other undesirable children. Then with number two, so notice with number one is dealing with the category of why we fought, right? Casus belli. And so it's containing its court history. It's saying we were right in fighting against fascism. It was a just cause, right? Number two is also court history and contending that we fought on the right side or in a just war because the manner in which our enemy fought. And then, of course, I'm using largely the book Unjust Enrichment. And it's, again, a pretty dark book, it's statistically and factually about all the non-combatants, the prisoners of war that were to be treated according to international law with, to have their basic shelter and food and water and not to be tortured, etc. They defied a lot of that. The Japanese did during World War II. It's just crazy to me, this fact right here from her book. Where is it? Right here. Take a look at that if you would. To compare the fates of American prisoners held in the two major theaters of war from 41 to 45, nearly 40% of U.S. military prisoners died in Japanese captivity, while just over 1% of American prisoners of war died in Nazi hands. 9 out of 10 prisoners who died in World War II perished while in Japanese custody. And I think of like some infamous cases is the one was the, and I have a couple here, but the Bataan Death March, you see right here. Many American POWs were actually murdered, as in the case of the infamous Bataan Death March in the Philippines in the spring of 42, when 5,000 of not quite 20,000 American prisoners of war perished amidst a 65-mile march across the peninsula. From an amalgamation of sources, some were bayoneted because as many were sick or wounded, they could not keep pace with the columns. Some were killed for defiance. Some died of exhaustion, starvation, or thirst, and others were simply murdered capriciously without any type of rhyme or reason. For instance, some of the sources that I've come across said like red hair, tall, anything that might make you stand out, they might brutalize you. And then in some cases, just to instill fear into the prisoners, they would do like the old infamous decimation, where they get that term, where the Romans would kill 1 out of every 10 soldiers that they caught. And so the Japanese, right, some horrific treatment. The case of Marus Maru being torpedoed as an unidentified carrier from Amboina. Eyewitness watched in horror as prisoners of war desperately swimming toward the Japanese vessels to avoid drowning or attack from sharks were hacked to pieces while trying to climb up the side of the vessels by Japanese soldiers carrying axes, unwilling to let them climb aboard to safety. And then you also have, and they boasted of this on some occasions. Japanese Admiral Mitsuo Matsunaga boasted to his press. The USS Houston, captured by Japanese soldiers, they were forced to build the Burma-Siam railway system amidst brutality. And so you have survival accounts of this, of American prisoners of war. They sometimes were were sent to the Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu were the big Japanese businesses that paid the military for laborers, for prisoners of war, to use in their factories to create the war machine and sell that war material back to the government and make money from. They did not pay wages to these prisoners of war. So that technically was against international law to exploit them in forced labor like that as well. And then, of course, you have, yeah, so I just have more facts on that if you want to look into it. But again, numbers 1 and 2 are court history. They're pro-US. They vilify the Axis powers. Number 1, as far as why we needed to fight them. Number 2 is how awfully they fought, right? The manner by which they fought. And then with number 3, it contends that we were not above using Machiavellian, right? Like, and I'm quoting this adjective from Machiavelli's The Prince, right? It's been a long time since I've read that, but he contended, right, that if you want to keep your power as a prince, you need to become amoral. Don't be constrained by notions of right and wrong, ethical and unethical, but simply do what works, what yields pragmatically the best results for you, whether those methods are immoral or not. And so the United States, in some cases, right, did just that. So for instance, we had a point system on carpet bombing, on bombing cities, right? And supposedly there's evidence that we were slow and we were hesitant to do this. There's evidence that the British did it first, and that the British, as our ally, really kind of, was part of the coaxing element of pushing us to do this. There is evidence in primary sources and secondary sources of such, but at the end of the day, we're still do what we want to do as a country, right? And what we did is we decided to do a point system. And so if they were making war material, if they're building, jet fighters for the Luftwaffe of Germany, or Japanese Zeros in a Tokyo manufacturing plant, then that was worth like 4 points. And if they had telecommunications that helped them communicate from one branch of the armed forces to the other, make plans to attack, etc., that might have been worth like 3 points. I used to have memorized the point system, but I don't. So this is more kind of hypothetical what I'm saying, okay? And so likewise, and so you had to accrue, let's say, more than 5 points for it to be considered a viable option to bomb that city. Hiroshima did not merit anything on the point system. They didn't have a major telecommunication system. They didn't have war manufactories going on. They were not on that list. And we dropped a hydrogen bomb on Hiroshima in August of 45, right? And we also used incendiary bombs, and bombs that we knew would cause ground fires, especially on wood buildings in Japan. And we did so knowingly of the consequences. So we used incendiary bombs. One city that we bombed the heck out of in Germany, that if you wanted to look into, was Dresden, Dresden, and an old Gothic with lots of Gothic churches and just beautiful ancient, not ancient, but at least medieval architecture and culture. We bombed the heck out of Dresden, and we dropped incendiary bombs that caused multiple fires and killed thousands of civilians in Germany. So we did do that. We also we cracked the code, right? The Bletchley Park and the English helped us out, but we largely cracked the code, especially of the Japanese. It was called Magic, the name of the code code inscription program. And under Magic, we set them up at Midway and took out 4 of their carriers, which was the turning point of the war. And it was a trap because we knew it from our decoding system, that we pulled them into that trap. But there were times when the Japanese began to become suspicious that maybe we were onto them, that we knew what they were going to do before they did it. You just imagine that, right? In sports analogy or something, right? That you have your opponent's plan book in football or something. You're like, okay, he's going to do a dive off the tackle with the tailback. And so we're going to drop more linebackers in and stuff it. And then, oh, this one, he's going to run. So we're going to play with more DBs, and we're going to have them do the deep zone, the third coverage or whatever. And sooner or later, the other coach is like, how did he know I was going to do this each time? Right. So at times you have to feign, you have to pretend that you don't see what's coming. Right. Because if the Japanese were to change their entire system, then all would be for naught, that we captured their system, right? That we deciphered their codes. So at any rate, at times we allowed our soldiers to be attacked without warning them. And the people high in command knew exactly what was coming, but they didn't let them know. So they would show spontaneity, surprise, unpreparedness. So it would alleviate the anxiety of the Japanese and make them rest assured and say, okay, no, maybe they don't have our codes deciphered. And so imagine being in a position to make those decisions that are going to take Americans' lives, right, on some of these attacks that were not shared with those lower in command. And then also I think of Schweinfurt, at a place called Schweinfurt in Germany. We used our bombers as bait. We knew that they were slow and cumbersome, and that the German Luftwaffe would have an easy pickings of them at a certain altitude, right? But we needed to get, because of their anti-aircraft sophisticated technology, we couldn't just bomb their Luftwaffe on the ground, supposedly, at Schweinfurt. We needed to get them to get the Luftwaffe up to a certain altitude so that we could have our P-51 Mustangs come after them, which had a superiority in several areas, supposedly. And so it happened just like that. And so they took out a lot of our bombers, but as far as a cost-benefit analysis, that was the sacrifice those in command were willing to make, were some of those bomber pilots, so that our P-51 Mustangs could take out a lot of the Luftwaffe fighters. And so just imagine being in that kind of situation where you have to make decisions that are going to take lives, take American lives as well. And so that's what you see on number 3, is that it's challenging the notion that this was a just war for us, contending that we fought in a pretty amoral fashion when it came to World War II. And not to mention, right, with the Japanese, when we found that the Japanese were not treating our prisoners of war well, we found that they were capturing American soldiers and torturing and murdering and mutilating their bodies, our soldiers in the Pacific responded in kind. And you have cases of them just doing awful things, capturing Japanese soldiers and cutting their teeth out while they're still alive, and just awful things. And so they fought viciously. If you look at little islands like Tarawa, Tarawa, Peleliu, Pelleiu. It's something close to that. I apologize. I always forget how to spell Peleliu. But just small area circumference-wise, as far as just square footage of these little islands. Thousands of soldiers died on these little islands in our island hopping campaign to try to slowly take back, the Coral Sea and the Marianas and the all these different island chains going back up to surrounding Japan itself, through the Philippines, etc. And that's another thing, is some people believe that we fought the Philippines, that we could have bypassed the Philippines. When you look at the Pacific Island map, there's room for differences of opinion as far as what were key areas to hit and island hop from those places, as opposed to islands right next to them. And so we tried to use, element of surprise, element of like Borneo having all that oil, as far as significance of certain resources on an island. But with the Philippines, people argue that we could have gone around the Philippines. But Douglas MacArthur, had promised he would come back. He had presidential aspirations, and that his ego was caught up into it. And he wanted to ensure that we took the Philippines over. And you look at like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and so forth. And it was bloody. It was very bloody, and some people contend unnecessary. So at any rate, there you have the theme for number 3, okay? The manner by which we fought. There, I believe, is the city of Dresden. One picture of it having been destroyed. And then number 4 is, as in number 3, it was revisionist history and saying, well, I don't think it was that just of a war because of the manner by which we fought it. With number 4, right, arguably, is I don't think we fought for the right reasons, as evidence in how we treated our racial minorities, our ethnic minorities during World War II. And so you have Executive Order 9066, the internment of about 120,000 Japanese immigrants and their children. Remember, their children, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, oftentimes were born here in the US. So technically, according to the 14th Amendment, were US citizens. And they were put into these, a couple dozen internment camps. And so that is very questionable constitutionally, right? Well, in court, Fred Korematsu sued the US, contending, hey, I'm a Californian. I was born here. And I have the right to, I shouldn't have to go into an internment camp during this war. And he lost. The Supreme Court made a conservative decision and said, we're under extreme conditions. We're in wartime, not peacetime. And therefore, the executive and the armed forces have the right in times such as these to issue such an order. And so then you have Tulare. If you wanted to look up Tulare, that was where we put our, quote, troublemakers, the Japanese, that when they were received these handouts with questions, these questionnaires, and they were asking them, who do you identify with, Japan or the US? Would you fight for the US? Should you be chosen by the federal government, asked, to fight? And those who said no to such questions, right? And oftentimes, according to the sources I read, it wasn't even so much a deeper affinity for Japan or an ideological leaning toward fascism or anything like that. Is a lot of them, it was just personal anger. They were angry with being thrown into these camps with barbed wire and armed guards that would shoot you if you were to try to escape. And it was their way of showing defiance in the midst of their youthful anger. And so they brought the, quote, troublemakers to Tulare, and they had a riot, and they likened it to like a prison riot, and they fired on the people with real bullets, and they killed a handful of them. So the number is very small, but one person is too many, right? One human life is awful. And there were a handful of Japanese internees who were killed in these camps. And so in Seattle, they were given an ultimatum to bring all that they could carry and nothing else. So there's a good book on that, All Which We Could Carry, on this topic of the internment. And a lot of them lost their property while they were in, and get this, some of them out of tax evasion. They're not there. They're not physically capable of paying their taxes, their property taxes, while they're in these internment camps. And so some of them lost their properties from it. And you don't have any kind of recompense or formal apology until the 1980s and 90s for this miscarriage of justice against Japanese. And America went wild with a couple sensationalist stories, is what supposedly happened. Is for one, is there was evidence in the investigation of Pearl Harbor, because as you probably know, as I put it, as the last number, the last argumentative section of the previous assignment with FDR, is some people believed from the start that Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy, that they didn't understand how they could be so ill prepared to defend against the attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And as they investigated it, and they made kind of scapegoats of Husband Kimmel and what was the other guy's name? Husband Kimmel was a leader of the Navy, and Walter Short was a leader of the Army. They were punished and stripped of their stripes. But they found evidence of Japanese civilians giving information to the Japanese military that were posing as inhabitants, as tourists there in Hawaii. And so hence there was a little bit of espionage, right? The as they call it, the fifth column, the secret fifth column that sneaks up from amongst us. And then there also had a Japanese prisoner of war that was taken, and on his person was found a map of the US, and they had attack routes through the Aleutian Islands into Alaska, down the coast of Canada into the west coast of California, and they had deployment symbols going all the way through the Rocky Mountains as far as a westward attack. And so then Americans were freaking out about this. And then you had the famous hot air balloons, these little balloon bombs that the Japanese sent across the Pacific. And one of them exploded in Oregon, where teachers were having a little trip for their students. And a couple curious students chased the balloon, because they were small in size, chased the balloon to their death as it exploded in Oregon territory. And so just a few cases like that, the country just ran with it and said, and not to mention, right, that the Japanese sent their envoys to declare war, and the envoys did not deliver the packages, the information declaring war before the attack. So it was a preemptive, quote, sneaky attack. And so then there was all this essentialism, this type of racism, that the Japs cannot be trusted. They're sneaky by nature, etc., and so forth. So at any rate, all that played into this paranoia, this hysteria that led to not only Executive Order 9066, but in some cases popular acceptance of this internment program. To this day, you could go down to Merced every summer, and they've had survivors, as far as, they were like toddlers, like little children at the time, who went through, or by this time, a lot of them are dying off time-wise with the lapsing of time, but at least firsthand stories, etc., because they had an internment camp in Merced, right here in Merced, and they have an anniversary for it every year. I've gone once, and it was very sadly intriguing. Then you also have the Zoot Suit riots toward Mexican Americans, right? If you look up the Zoot Suit riots, there was Jose Leiva was murdered, and they blamed a group of young Mexican Americans who called themselves Pachucos, in Southern California, and they had a distinctive zoot suit and kind of look that they had about them as kind of a cultural statement during the 40s. And it was accompanied, this murder case was accompanied by an occasion in which a young Pachuco, in quotes, broke the jaw of a U.S. Navy guy over whistling at his girlfriend, and they got an altercation over it. And so then the Navy gentleman returned to his ship at Huntington, or so around Huntington Beach, and word spread of him being struck by this young Mexican American, and military personnel, just privates, people that were infantry, foot soldiers, etc., were coming all the way from Nevada into LA to fight Pachucos. And you had fistfights, you had cases of people bloodied on the streets. It was just ugly. And so then you have cases of Texas soldiers at the Rapido River in Italy, who said that they were sent on a suicide mission to cross that Rapido River in Italy with just multiple machine gun nests just waiting for them to get out of the bushes into the water. And some of them refused to fight, and others went obediently immediately to their death. And so there was a case over that, the Rapido River case, and then continuing that there was discrimination against Mexican soldiers and using them as cannon fodder, if you will, in the Italian theater of fighting. And then you also had the case of, well, we'll get to that, but there will be a case over the burial of a Mexican-American soldier who was killed in the Philippines, and his Texas town refused to allow him to be buried in the military cemetery because he was Latino. So you have evidence of such. You still had the segregation of Black soldiers up through World War II. This will be the final war where that is the case. You also have African-American women. I remember reading this in school. It was called Abiding Courage. It's a good book, but this is like on the cover of it, these two African-American women. And, Rosie the Riveter, right? With these young ladies, a lot of young Black women heard about the Kaiser shipyard jobs that were opening up in Oakland, in Richmond, in the East Bay of California, of Northern California. And they came by the tens of thousands to get these well-paid jobs of riveting airplane wings, welding and doing the man's work and getting good pay for it. But nevertheless, they experienced white flight. A lot of people in the Berkeley area, Oakland area, etc., who were Anglo-American, white Americans, left, fled with this influx of Black people, and they became de facto kind of ethnic enclaves of African Americans, right? Like Oakland and Richmond to this day. And so they were treated awfully. They were not allowed into some of the restaurants and the hotels. They had a hard time getting people to allow them to rent from them or buy homes from them because of the color of their skin. And here they were serving the country, the war effort in these war plants. So on number 4, I'm being revisionist and saying, was it really a just war? And so as I have here at the bottom, right? We were a, quote, lesser evil at best. So that's a strongly pessimistic expression that I end with. Let me make sure I have 2 names that have been here for a while that I didn't initially write down. I want to make sure you get your credit for being here today. All right, so are there any questions? Any questions about what we've covered? What a fascinating topic, right? And I'm sorry if I didn't, share it in an engaging manner. If I didn't, it's on me, because the material itself is fascinating.
No question, Professor. But you're right; it is interesting. It's heavy, though. I mean, of course, I've heard about World War II over and over and over again. But certain points he made about the gruesomeness of the war it was pretty bad.
It was. Thank you, Cody. I appreciate your participation more than you know. But yeah, absolutely. It just the manner in which it was fought and how vicious it became on some fronts, especially in the Pacific against the Japanese, where you clearly had a racist animosity added to the sense of betrayal that they had, hit us unprepared at Pearl Harbor. And it's something else. It's there's no wonder, right, that there are several Hollywood movies and so many documentaries to this and so forth. And recall that this is the same generation that is combating the Great Depression. And so you have Brokaw's boast, right, that this was the quote greatest generation that was fighting here in this World War II. But as you see, they were not above, animosity, and they did not always adhere to, if we're going to use as a measuring stick, the Judeo-Christian notion of just war doctrine. All right, so thank you, Cody. Can I get some thumbs up? Do you guys feel okay about the material, relatively prepared for the assignment? Thank you. Relatively kind of apprised of the basics of World War II. Good. All right. And then also I feel beholden to at least briefly mention is that you have evidence of diplomatic overtures from Japan to us by the time we began surrounding the Japanese islands and by the time we got to Iwo Jima, etc., right? For peace, overtures toward us. But the conservative argument is it doesn't matter what the diplomatic civilian leaders were wanting in Japan, that clearly Tojo and the military were the ones that were running the show, and that they adhered to the samurai code of Bushido, of death before dishonor. And so when you look at, like I mentioned, the little islands of Tarawa and Peleliu, you look at Saipan, Saipan, there were mass suicides by the Japanese because they were told, right, that they, under no circumstances do you surrender to the Americans. And they also were told horrific stories of horrific things we would do to them if we were to capture them alive. So in Saipan in particular, thousands of civilians began diving off cliffs, or at least hundreds. And they sadly have footage of it. And so President Truman comes in as a new president, and he does not have the same personality as Franklin Roosevelt. And we don't know to this day, with certainty, if Roosevelt would have used those atomic weapons that we devised in Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the Manhattan Project, and Robert Oppenheimer and his scientists. And that's another irony to the side also, is look up the members of the Manhattan Project and see how many of them were associated with victimized groups in Europe by Nazi Germany, either Jewish or Scandinavian or some country that was taken over by the Nazis. And you find an irony there that Hitler kind of inadvertently caused this brain trust to be used against him in this war. But with the Manhattan Project and so forth, we don't know if Franklin Roosevelt would have used the weapons or not, especially if he would have used them twice. And Truman comes in as a much more Manichaean character, and Manichaean used in a negative sense, kind of someone who just sees things a little bit too simplistically as good versus evil, black and white, right and wrong, and there's no shady gray area with him. And so you also have depictions of Truman as having a little bit of a little man's complex, of always feeling like he needed to prove how tough he was and so forth. So when you do great man history of Truman and investigating his character, his personality, the way that he thought, etc., and behaved, some people think that we may not have had those droppings of the bomb had Franklin Roosevelt not died in the midst of his fourth term and Truman come in. But what Truman does, as you might guess, is he points to Peleliu, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and says, look at the fanaticism with which the Japanese are fighting. They clearly are going to go down swinging, and we need to psychologically break them. We need to frighten them. We need to break their morale, their will, by showing them this new horrific weapon and exactly what it can do. And sadly, we chose Hiroshima. Some people infer from several facts, precisely because it did not merit anything on the point system and it was untouched. So the Japanese couldn't say, oh, well, it was destroyed already. It was in pristine shape before the dropping of August 6th, 1945. And so we dropped that bomb, and my goodness, right? It just instantly vaporizes thousands of people, ends up killing tens of thousands more within days. And we only give them 2 days to look over it and to observe what kind of damage this bomb could do. And then on August 9th, we drop another one on Nagasaki. And so, to this day, people contend, it's ironic that we freak out when a certain developing country or something, I remember at one time, like Pakistan, Iran, and I don't mean to get political in the sense that, and I'm not even trying to convey what I think on the subject. I'm really not. I'm just trying to just provoke thought. But some people contend that it's ironic that we freak out when a country starts developing nuclear power, but we're the only ones to have used it, and twice in 3 days against a single country and against civilian targets and cities. So at any rate, I just thought that was worth mentioning as far as, popular discourse of what people argue about and talk about when they usually run the narrative of World War II. But at the end, as we're going to get into next, is at the very best, we were always strange bedfellows with the Soviet Union. We were ideologically opposed to each other, having a capitalist economy, them having a communist economy, us having an allegedly liberal government, them having a much more totalitarian government under Stalin. And we just happened to share the same enemy. And so we're going to chase from the West the Nazis into Berlin. The Russians are going to chase them from the East into Berlin. And it's going to be awkward between us and the Russians at the end of the war. And so it's, no sooner is this war won against the fascist countries than we're in a, quote, Cold War with the Soviet Union. And that'll be the next topic. All right, so I have all your names. Any last minute one last call for any questions before we go ahead and give one another adieu. Shamgar.
There was these couple assignments. I sent you a message on Canvas, but I don't think you saw it. There
Oh,
was
I'm
like
sorry.
it's like a bunch of quizzes that were all due yesterday.
Oh, thank you, Shamgar. Thank you. I tell you what, I am going to, when we're done with this video, I'm going to send out an announcement, and I'm going to, for those who have done it, great, but I'm going to send out an extension to that.
Oh, so they were actually due yesterday then.
Yes, they were. Yeah, that's what I had planned. But it may have been you, Shamgar. Someone had brought it to my attention last week that they were to be due the same day as an assignment, and I don't like that idea either.
All right.
So I'm going to go onto the properties of the quizzes, and I'm going to extend it to like Wednesday night.
All right.
And tell everybody and apologize for waiting this long to let you know about that. But yeah, I feel like as far as the due date, I feel like I gave you guys plenty of time to get your books, and to do those quizzes independently, as far as being relatively deep into the semester at this point. But I don't like the idea that I had them do the same night as an assignment.
Yeah, that's fine. And
all right.
thank
So
you.
thank you, Shamgar. Thank you for bringing that to my attention again.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So no problem. All right. I'll definitely do that. So you guys will get an announcement on that very soon. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, you guys, thank you so much. Thank you for coming. I have your names. Let me check one last time on the second page. Yes, I have all these names. You guys absolutely deserve your extra credit points and will receive them. Thank you for your patience on grading. And as I'm working on catching up, I did a couple. I don't know if you've noticed in the last few days, I did 2 assignments for you, and I'm going to do 2 more in the next couple of days as well. All right, so thank you, and you guys have a great week. Okay.
Thank you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.